Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we are finally going to be continuing our series, The Good, the Bad, and Philosophy. In this video we're going to be looking at what is utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism, the paradigm case of consequentialism, is known as utilitarianism, which was originally championed by the likes of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Classic utilitarianism is a normative ethical theory which claims that the good course of action is the one that creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, though this is probably an oversimplification. In the map of consequentialism, we outline 10 different distinctions of types of consequentialism and briefly mentioned where utilitarianism would fall on those distinctions. In this video, we're going to delve into how utilitarianism will fall on each of these distinctions in more depth and what those distinctions mean for the position. And then at the end of the video, we'll give a summary of the position with a little bit more depth than the one we offered here. So, first off, utilitarianism is a type of actual consequentialism. That means that what we care about are the actual consequences of an event, rather than the expected consequences that either you might predict or someone else might predict. Even if the odds that an act would create more happiness are objectively 99 times out of 100, or if from your perspective you see it as certain that your act will create more happiness or more pleasure than pain, if it actually does not, if you're the 1 time out of 100, or if your view of it being certain was really wrong, then it is going to be bad by the standards of utilitarianism, because we care about the actual consequences, not the expected ones. In a future video, we'll look at the foil of this position, which is expected consequentialism, and some of the problems for actual versions versus problems for expected versions. Utilitarianism is also a type of hedonistic consequentialism. This means that the types of consequences that we care about are only pleasure. Some of the proponents of utilitarianism, notably Bentham and Mill, have posited various kinds of pleasure so that eating a delicious sandwich and reading poetry could be different kinds or more or less important kinds of pleasure, kind of higher and lower pleasures, which we should count as positive consequences or more positive for the higher pleasures and so on. But that doesn't change the basic tenet that pleasure is the only consequence that we care about. But that's an iffy issue. If you really wanted to go with the stripped down version of utilitarianism, it would just say that pleasure is the only good, period, full stop, and not make some of those distinctions. Utilitarianism is also a type of direct, also known as act consequentialism. This means that we judge actions based on the consequences of those actions, not based on, say, their conformity to rules which have been shown to generally create good consequences. So we're not following general rules like don't kill people, for example, which generally create good consequences. We are analyzing each situation in the moment to say, is my action in this situation going to create good or bad consequences? Not, would generally this action create good or bad consequences? This is contrasted with rule consequentialism, which, as I said, is basically going to say, let's make some rules based on what generally are the consequences, because you can't predict the consequences in every situation, and even if you do, then you might still get in trouble when you judge the consequences wrongly, and so on and so forth, but it has its own set of problems, and there's a debate as to whether rule consequentialism is really consequentialism or in fact a form of deontology. I don't think in this series, but in a future series, we will look at the distinction between direct and rule, or between act and rule utilitarianism, or act and rule consequentialism. Consequentialism also can be distinguished between universal and particular. Utilitarianism is going to be the universal type of consequentialism. This means that it applies to everyone, or it is everyone's pleasure that we're counting, or everyone that is affected by this action. All those people's pleasure is being counted, not just some of those people's pleasure, and we're ignoring those people because we don't like them. Some utilitarians might claim that this means we should care about pleasure for animals, or any being that can feel pleasure or pain. Of course, there's a debate as to, are animals even conscious? Does that mean that they can feel pleasure or pain, and so on and so forth? And that's probably a debate for the philosophy of mind. Others might claim that it's only human pain or human pleasure that we're worrying about, which might fall into maybe being more restrictive on the hedonistic explanation, saying we are caring not just about pleasure, but about human pleasure and keeping the universal criteria, or not restricting the hedonistic and restricting the universal criteria down to a more particularist criteria or particular consequentialist position, saying we're only caring about human pleasure or human pain. Now, utilitarianism is also going to be an evaluative version of consequentialism. This kind of follows from some of the other positions like the hedonistic side, but for larger and kind of pluralistic consequentialisms, this is going to matter more. So the only elements of the consequences that we are assessing are the normative ones, which is in this case pleasure. We are not allowed to consider other extenuating circumstances and testing consequences based on anything other than the consequences, that the things that we're considering are good and bad, pain or pleasure. We're not allowing extenuating circumstances which, well, this consequence had more pain and less pleasure than this other one, but there were extenuating circumstances. No, we're evaluating solely on the evaluative, the value-ridden consequences, the pain and the pleasure. Okay? Now, utilitarianism is a type of equal consequentialism. That means that we are assessing consequences equally for all types of people. No one gets any special treatment, and pleasure or pain for one person counts the same as for everyone else. Just because it might be nice to say that, oh, well, pleasure for me should be more important than pleasure for you. No. For classic utilitarianism, we're counting all things as equal. So we're saying that you spending maybe $10 to help the child in front of you from starving for a day is actually a worse action than you spending $10 to help 20 children around the world from starving for a week. But that's going to get into its own problems. So if you're curious about that, check out my videos on Give Well and some of the problems there. Utilitarianism is also kind of maximizing consequentialism. That means that it's focused on the most good for the most people. This makes it a maximizing type. To be good, an action must create the best consequences, not just above average ones. It must maximize the good. Utilitarianism is also an aggregate form of consequentialism. That means that we determine what is good by counting up all of the positive and negative consequences of an action and comparing that with the net positive consequences, all the positive and negative, of some other choice. It's the results of your action that determine it, not just looking at a list of possible worlds and saying, where does this rank in that list? Utilitarianism is also a type of total consequentialism. In other words, good is determined by the sum of all the consequences for everyone affected. This means that an action which creates a small amount of good for a large number of people would rank as a better choice than one which creates a lot of good for a small number of people if that action that created a small number of good for a large number of people made more total good overall. If you're curious with some of the problems of that, check out my video on Derek Parfit's repugnant conclusion. And finally, utilitarianism is a theory of consequentialism which is agent neutral. This means that how we are viewing which action has the best consequences should not be determined by who is assessing the consequences. Everyone should decide which consequences are the best or which choice to make equally. Therefore, in summary, utilitarians count up all and only the pleasure and pain of their actions that they cause to everyone and that they affect from an objective standpoint. The action which maximizes happiness is the good action and the choice you should make. So that was utilitarianism. Next up, we're going to take a look at pluralistic consequentialism, followed by expected consequentialism. Then we'll move on to virtue ethics. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Stay tuned when we're done with this series for us tackling some actual ethical questions in the world, some applied ethical questions, and seeing how these normative theories of ethics would fit. Stay skeptical, everybody.